Hi folks, welcome back. This is the second part of my little section on tools of the trade. Today we're going to talk about hand tools. Well, notice that I'm in the little heated shop today because we've had quite a deep freeze, and so what I figured I'd do is I'd bring down a decent little cross section of the hand tools that I use into the heated shop and show them off here. It'd be a little easier on the hands, but also my hope is the sound and the light will be a little bit better as well. So I didn't bring everything down with me. I don't have everything here, but I think I at least have a decent cross section of the tools that I use for the most part in my timber framing work. So let's clean the bench off here and take a look. Okay, so here's the hand tool portion of my arsenal. This is what I'll be using in this job and what I've used in other jobs. I think I have most everything here. There are a couple of things that are away on a job site somewhere else, but this is the main arsenal of tools. So, I'll start at the top. When I start actually using these in the project in a bit more detail, I will talk about them in a little bit more detail then. But and if just a warning, if you're a hand tool aficionado and all your tools need to be in impeccable condition, you might want to just skip ahead a couple of minutes. So this is number 6. This is made by Veritas. And it's yeah, this is fantastic. I would love a number 8 or even a number 9, just because the longer sole on the bigger workpieces just makes a lot of sense. This is a very heavily used, well loved shoulder plane, 1 inch by Veritas as well. It's when you're trying to decide, and I'll just talk more about this later, but when you're trying to decide what tool to use, especially for cleaning up a shoulder, where a shoulder meets a cheek on a tenon. It depends on the grain situation. It depends on what you're doing, the particulars of the piece of wood that you're working on. But sometimes the chisel works just fine. But sometimes you really want to grab this, and it's just a pleasure to use. And of course, this actually isn't the block plane I use most. I have a Veritas block plane that I use, but that's off on a kitchen install that I'm doing right now. But the block plane, of course, is excellent, especially for putting a little chamfer on the edges of tenons and that sort of stuff. So now the big thing that everybody thinks of with timber framing, of course, is the big heavy chisels. I'll start with the most heavily used. This is a bar 2-inch chisel, made in USA. These are hand forged. Just an absolute pleasure to use. This is the chisel that has gotten the most use, and I'm sure will continue to get the most use. It just feels perfect in my hand. It is a socket chisel, and everything about it just feels absolutely perfect. The steel holds an edge very well. It takes a beating and keeps an edge. So this is just an absolute treat. This is a cheaper chisel, also from Lee Valley. All the names are worn off it, but I think it's a Sorby. It's 1.5 inch, so I use this on smaller mortises. But I also use it in other situations because the grind is different on this one. It's a sharper angle, so actually it's a steeper angle. So it's I used this a lot when I was foolish enough to do some work in spruce, just because it seemed to cut better. Also great if you have someone who wants to come and give you a hand because you have a second chisel. I do use this a fair amount. This is a corner chisel. This is also handmade by Bar Tools, and I don't use it as much as I thought I would. It seems like a really cool idea, and I probably would use it more if I really got the hang of it. But the problem is, and I can show you this as we get further on, the problem with it is if you're trying to make a nice, really crisp, clean corner, then you have to have the thing aligned perfectly this way and this way, and as you're driving it down into the mortise, you have to maintain that the whole way, otherwise you end up getting askew and your mortise isn't correct. So yeah, I don't know a lot of timber framers that actually use these, but they seem like a really cool idea. However, I did buy it so I think I am going to continue to practice and see if I can get more proficient with it. Now this is what they call a slick. A slick is, and I'll get into more detail on this later on, but a slick is essentially a very wide chisel that is designed not to be struck with a mallet. So this is used just to flatten off high spots, for example. But it's also used as a relatively coarse tool, though when it's very sharp, it can actually be quite elegant. I need to clean this one up a little bit. It was left with some pitch on it for a while. But this is a really cool tool because it was built in British Columbia by Caribou Blades. You want to look them up; they're really neat. So these were all the steel for these was made from recycled circular sawmills from the timber industry, from the logging sawmill industry, and so basically they cut it out of enormous saw blades, and they live out in the woods in the middle of nowhere, and turn them into timber framing tools. And they're very expensive, but they're very cool with tremendous attention to detail, and it's a really nice tool to have. For striking the chisels, you want a wooden mallet. This is actually, I don't know what it is, but it's some tropical hardwood. So I took the Steve Chappell's timber framing course in '09, I think, and one of the bits of swag that he gave out to his students were these mallets. And I don't know if you can see it on camera, but this has been pounded into the ends of these chisels thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and it's barely even dented. So this is some pretty amazing stuff. You really want, if you're looking for something that you're going to use all day, if you have normal size hands, you're probably going to want a handle that's probably a little bigger than you would intuitively think. I often will use this one kind of choked up like this, but if I need a little extra, I will grab it down here. But this looks really big, but it actually feels quite natural in your hand. So a mallet of this style is my preference, and this is basically the only one I use. Chalk lines. Why I use them, I'll get into that later when we talk about layout and square roll. But chalk lines are, well, they're a dime a dozen, but this particular one, I don't know who makes it. The name is all gone now, but this particular one uses a fine thread. But it's still very strong, and it leaves a fairly fine line, which is important. There are also a style of line that's called an ink line, which I've never used, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get one, and I'm going to try it on this job, and you can see how it works out. But apparently the ink line is supposed to leave an even finer line, so I would like to try one. And always extra chalk. Gotta have your extra chalk with you. I use both mechanical pencils and conventional pencils. There's not a lot of life left in this, so you have to have a good pencil sharpener with you. Don't go to the store and buy a pencil sharpener assuming it will work, because 3/4 of them are terrible. You have to try them. And that one leaves a very nice, crisp point without breaking the lead. For saws, of course, I do most of the sawing with the power tools, with the electric saws. But I do have a crosscut and a rip saw. I have other chisels and other planes. This is just sort of an example. I didn't want to dig up everything. This is just sort of the main ones I use. But I have other chisels, and I have other planes, and I have another whacking mallet, and I also have a whole bunch of different saw blades, or saws. But this is the crosscut saw that I use. It's actually from Home Depot, I think, but for the money, it's fantastic. It does have a Japanese tooth pattern, which means you will never sharpen it. Well, never say never, but yeah, I've known people that have tried to sharpen these, and yeah, it's not worth it. But they're surprisingly good. They're surprisingly straight. They're surprisingly strong, and the edge lasts forever. So, of course, I wanted a nice old crosscut saw, just because I like older tools. But when I got this one, it just works so well. I haven't really been looking. So over here, this is a nice old rip saw that I got at a flea market, and it has a progressive tooth pattern, which makes it really easy to start. Any maker's marks on it are all long gone, but it is sharp and it works really well. I use this all the time, especially for finishing up the cheeks of tenons that I can't do with the big saw. Okay, the one power tool I didn't show in the other segment was the drills. I have a couple of different drills. Drilling through, say, 10 inches of oak or pine is hard work. You typically want a powerful, slow speed drill, and you do want a D handle if you can, or one with a 90-degree handle off the side, because it's just, there's a lot of torque, and yeah, you want to be careful, because lots of people, including me, have hurt their wrists with those things. So I have all kinds of different bits, all different diameters, all different lengths, and a few different brands. But I actually, probably 2 years ago, and I'm not sponsored by anybody at all. So if I'm plugging anything, it's just because I think it's great. I've been so impressed with these Wood Owl bits. It's amazing. This very drill has done one large timber framing job and 3 small timber framing jobs. And it probably could use sharpening. I'm sure it can use sharpening, but it's still going. And I was using my great big corded drill for the longest time, dragging extension cords out and the whole works. And this thing was cutting so effortlessly, I actually ended up trying it with a medium duty cordless drill, and then ended up finishing that entire job and doing 3 more jobs with this bit and a mid-sized cordless drill. That's how fantastic. Now that's in pine with a little bit of oak, but yeah, it's pretty amazing. They will also supply you with files, so you can file the tips of these. I'll see if I can get a decent close-up of the tip for you. Though it's not terribly complicated to file if you want. And yeah, they're just fantastic. So I don't think I'm going to even bother exploring any other ones. I have a whole bunch of these now, and you'll see these in action for sure. Okay, so a couple of levels. I'm not going to get into these too much right now, because that involves I use these a lot in the square roll layout system, so I'll get into that later. But they are essential, and they're always in my layout toolbox. Angle finder, if you end up with joinery requiring odd angles, especially when you get into valleys and rafters and dormers and where they all intersect and everything like that, one of these is fantastic. I use this all the time in carpentry work, and kitchen renovation work and all that sort of stuff anyway, so I needed to own it. They are quite expensive, but they are worth it, and I use it all the time in timber framing. And once I've established and measured the angle, and I usually just lock it in with one of these and use that for the majority of the layout work, and then put this away somewhere safe, because it is quite valuable. All kinds of different tape measures. When you're doing timber framing work, of course, you're often using big, heavy timbers, long timbers, so you need a long tape measure. But what I have found is oftentimes you're not actually winding the whole thing out. You may at the very beginning when you're verifying the lengths, but typically you're referencing from a certain point. You're not going the whole length of the timber. So even though I'm using, even though I have a 36 foot and 26 foot, one of the ones that I use the most is this little 26 foot, and I have a 15 footer. And one thing, and I'm going to show you this, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison, but one thing you have to realize: do not assume all your tape measures are accurate. One of the first things that we did in the timber framing course that I took eons ago is everybody took their tape measures, stretched them out along a beam, and almost every single tape measure was different. So make sure all your tape measures are the same. I have a bunch of these lying around. They're fantastic. They're cheap because they always get dropped and stepped on. So I have a whole bunch of them, and they're great for scoring across the grain to make cuts cleaner. Also great for sharpening your carpenter's pencil. Not everybody is as concerned about this as I am. I am a part-time musician, and if you're interested, the music that you hear in these videos is me playing guitar. That way I don't have to pay anybody royalties. So, yeah, eye and ear protection. Obviously, the eye protection most people are on board with. You don't want, chips of sawdust in your eyeballs. In the ear, because I'm a part-time musician, I'm really concerned about my ears, so I'm always wearing ear protection. And typically, I usually will wear earplugs because they're a lot cooler in the, on a warm summer day. Combination square. This is used all the time. Now this is a Starrett, so this is a very expensive one. However, this one got knocked off a table one time, and I no longer trust it for using for machine setup and whatnot. So it got thrown into the timber framing pile. I'm sure it's still extremely accurate. I'm sure it's more accurate than I need. But it's fantastic for verifying that your mortises are, well, it's too complicated to get into right now. Make sure the walls of your mortises are on the angle that they're supposed to be. But it's also great as a depth gauge, making sure your mortise is as deep as you want it to be. So you just set it, say you've got a 5-inch mortise, plus you're giving yourself a 1/4 inch at the bottom, depending on how green your timbers are, and you just run around and verify the depth everywhere. And it's great to do because it means on raising day you don't find that you're a 1/4 inch too short somewhere and the frame doesn't go together. So lots of people use different things. I use this for this old mallet for driving pegs. This was in my great-grandfather's workshop, and it was always up there. And I just, of course, he died a long time ago. And I got a hold of a number of his tools, and this is what I use for driving all my pegs. And I just love it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about sharpening, but I think I'm going to stop the video here for a minute, get rid of all this stuff, and talk in a little bit more detail about sharpening. Okay, so I made some room here for the last few bits and pieces before we talk about sharpening. Of course, absolutely indispensable in many aspects of the project, but certainly in layout is good old framing square. And much like a tape measure, you can't just go buy it at the store and assume that it's perfect. You have to check. Second best to that is purchasing one that comes with a guarantee. I know Lee Valley sells a Japanese brand that comes with certifications, and I believe they verify them as well. So that's great. This is actually a Steve Chappell square. We'll get into talking a bit more about squares later on, but this is also made in USA and comes with guarantees of accuracy in the whole work. So this is an absolute treat to use. Also with layout, when I'm drawing a lot of lines, especially on a more complex joint, and I don't need the full length of the framing square, I have a number of these different steel rules that I use regularly. The steel rules are actually a little bit thinner than a framing square, and that, if you're really trying to be accurate, that can actually be a little bit easier than a framing square. But it's simply just a smaller thing, and it's easier to move around than a framing square sometimes. So I keep a whole bunch of these things around in different lengths. So other than what I forgot, that's the meat of it. That would be the majority of what I would take with me out on a timber framing job. Now, as with everything else, woodworking, carpentry, sharp tools are just make the job so much more enjoyable and so much easier. Now, I'm just going to describe to you in general terms how I go about this, because if you want to start a fight in a room full of woodworkers, just talk about the best way to sharpen tools. I mean, it's almost as bad as, do you cut your pins or tails first when you're doing your dovetails? I'm just going to tell you how I go about it. I used and still use in the shop. I will use Waterstones, but oftentimes when you're timber framing and you're off on the job site somewhere, you can be there at any time of year. Waterstones are great, but if they freeze, they break, and I just don't want to be worried about that. So I don't use the Waterstones for the timber framing tools at all. Now this is my go-to. on the job site. This is what I use to rejuvenate a chisel that is starting to get dull when I'm on the job site. These are diamond plates, and they are lubricated with water, but they don't soak anything up, so they can freeze, and it's not a big deal. They're very expensive, and I probably have worn this one out on maybe 5 jobs. I can't remember. I think they're around $180 or something like that. Now, I haven't had any really nasty dings out of my chisels, so most of the wear is on the fine side. You can buy these in all different grades. So there's 2 different grades, one on each side. And yeah, to me, it's the least fragile. It's the most portable, and to me, for on-site work, it's the most logical. It's the most logical option for sharpening. And even though they are very expensive, I will be buying another one because it's worth it. So that being said, when you occasionally, what happens, and I'll give you a quick demonstration of that here. What happens is you have your chisel, say at an absolute perfect angle, and it's just what you want. Now it may just be me, but when I'm sharpening by hand, I'm not going to do it because I don't have any water in here, but when I'm sharpening by hand, what you're always doing is you're always chasing that very, very sharp edge. So you want to see the swarf build up just a tiny bit. And typically what happens with me, and if it happens to other people too, I'd love to hear it, so I'm not the only one. Typically what happens is you end up with the angle getting slightly steeper, say over the course of a couple of months. And what that means is that the cutting geometry of the chisel changes. And it always, for me, it always just gets slightly cheaper, or slightly steeper. So what I have to do is, at the end of a job, I'll come back to the shop and I will rejuvenate that chisel. Now, I do have a nice powered grinder, but one option that I used for years before I had that was PSA sandpaper on plate glass. The plate glass is always flat. You don't have to worry about flattening like you do Waterstones. And I find the film lasts a long time. Some of the detractors for this system say the film is expensive, and that's true, but I've always found that it lasts a long time. So, to rejuvenate the edge on a chisel, now what I do is, it's on the little envelope that I keep all this in. I have all of my chisels, all my woodworking chisels, all my timber framing chisels, all written down with the bevel angle that I'm using on that chisel and what I like. So, in order to get back to that, exactly that, I am not too proud to admit that I use a honing guide. I don't use these on the job site. I always just hone by hand, and it's absolutely fine. But if I want to get back to a known angle, I will use a honing guide. On the job site, sometimes for planes, if I need to rejuvenate the edge of a plane, I will use this smaller roller guide. But when it comes to rejuvenating things in the shop, I will use a honing guide, and I'll usually use this one. This one is by Veritas as well. I'll put a link in the description down below to a video that describes the use of this fairly well. But essentially what it does is it helps you guarantee that you get exactly the angle that you already know you like, straight 90 degrees to the edge of your chisel. So yeah, so I use that. Now, I don't want to get into this too much because it's a great way to start arguments, but I find that in my experience, and when I was first starting to do this, before I was able to sharpen by eye at all, using a honing guide allowed me to enjoy the craft. Because everybody knows that using sharp tools is safer and makes it more enjoyable. And what that translates to is if you're just a hobbyist or an amateur, it means you want to get back out there and do it again because it's enjoyable. To me, yes, you have to spend a little bit of money on a honing guide, but it means you will enjoy the craft and you'll keep doing it. To me, that's worth it. However, that said, I do recommend that you, when you have the time and the inclination and the patience, I do recommend that you do work on your hand honing and hand sharpening skills. It is faster,
and it is more convenient. And if you try it and you fail, you can always go back to your guide. And eventually, if you get really good at it, you can sell your guide, you know, get half of your money back. And in my opinion, it was money very well spent. So, in a nutshell, this is my field sharpening scenario, and this is my shop sharpening scenario. Works great for me. If you have a different, approach, if you have different thought, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, folks, thanks for joining me. That's what I'm calling the tools of the trade portion of this little series. I know there are some of you that are also interested in the big machines I have in the big shop, and if there's enough interest, maybe I'll do a little section on those as well. But coming up, the big crosscut saw that I've been working on, I had to take some bits and pieces to a machine shop and be reworked. That should be back before too long, and I can finish up the video on that. So that'll be coming up. But I've also collected a bunch of footage of the planing process of the big tie beams, and I've done an assessment of those and done some trial layout and all that sort of stuff. So I think the next video will probably focus on that. But right now we are in a pretty serious deep freeze up here, so I've been spending a lot of time in the heated shop doing some small shop work, which has been a bit of a break. Thank you very much for watching. Again, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, hit the thumbs up button. We'll see you next time. Thank you.